In addition to the attributions that we make, we also make impressions and interpretations when we are perceiving others. And you've probably heard the saying that first impressions matter, and science has bared this out. Studies have demonstrated that people tend to hover on first impressions, and they call this the primacy effect. So the primacy effect leads us to place more value on the first information that we receive about a person. And so we tend to get positive interpretations from positive first impressions and negative interpretations from negative first impressions. The flip side of the primacy effect is the recency effect. The recency effect says that we can put more weight on our most recent impressions of someone over the earlier impressions that we have. So even if you made a really positive first impression on someone, that impression can be tarnished by a really negative final impression if we leave a bad taste in their mouth. And this can go either way, right? We could start with a really negative first impression and somehow break through that to make a positive last impression, so to speak. And this leads to what is called the horn and halo effects. So the horn and halo effects essentially say that we have a tendency to adapt information that conflicts with our earlier impressions, our initial perceptions, in order to make them fit within the frame that we have established. So our initial impressions distort our later impressions, and we call this selective distortion. So the halo effect occurs when we have a really positive initial perception, and that initial positive perception leads us to view later behaviors and later impressions as being really positive. Whereas the horn effect occurs when our initial perception is really negative, and that negative perception leads us to view later interactions as being more negative. So even if the person objectively isn't doing something that is really negative, we twist and distort that information in our brains if we had a really negative first impression of that action being really negative, and vice versa. So the horn and halo effects can have really profound impacts on the ways that we perceive each other. In addition, our physical and environmental factors also influence the ways that we perceive others. When we're talking about the physical influences, we're talking about things like the style of dress and how the person is groomed and even how attractive they are. All of these things play an important role in how we perceive others. We look at how others are dressed, and that makes an impact on us. There are many companies that have very strict guidelines for how their employees are meant to dress because of this, right? They want people to have a really positive perception of the company, and the employees are part of that. So oftentimes it's very important what the employees wear to work so that they put off a certain perception. But in addition to that, whether or not we find someone just attractive also impacts the way that we perceive them and their subsequent behaviors. So if we find someone really attractive, we tend to perceive them much more positively and therefore perceive their behaviors as being really positive. Whereas if we don't find someone very attractive, that effect isn't going to be there as strongly. In addition to these physical influences, we also have environmental factors that impact the way that we perceive others. And I'm talking about material objects here. So the material objects that people surround themselves with can influence the way that others perceive them. So for example, when a student goes into a teacher's office hours, they are often impacted by the way that the office feels. If the office is really barren, there's not much personality to it, it's just 4 gray walls, a desk and a chair, that's going to make a very different impression than an office that is clean but has decorations, right? They have trophies or awards, if they have books or posters or pictures, all of those material objects are going to change the way that the student might perceive the professor, right? So the material objects that we surround ourselves with, whether that is in an office space on a desk, or whether that is in our own homes, in an apartment, that is going to have an impact on the way that others perceive us. So there are lots of different factors, as you can see, that play a role in the ways that we perceive others.